and they start recruiting. They're not interested in chasing down communist agents anymore. That wasn't the point. The point wasn't to turn the church into a Marxist wonderland. The point was to destroy the church. So anybody else now they want to recruit, what do? Well, now they start to staff their seminaries. They start to staff their chanceries. You don't need, a whole chancery of crazy people. You just need 2 or 3 or 4 people here or there who are willing to go along with the plan of the church needs to be reformed. And so they start reforming it. Who you put in charge of your vocation recruitment office, your director of vocation, the rector of the seminary, those 3 positions out of an entire staff in a typical diocese, those 3 positions alone would ensure that within 20 years, your diocese would be essentially wiped out. Why? Because who comes in? You screen out Orthodox guys, you don't let them in. You call them rigid. You say they've got a problem with women, or they don't understand this or that. You find some excuse to make sure they just get out of, you don't let them in. But who do you let in? Well, you bring in people now who are like-minded with you. They want the church to be completely changed. And then they go through and they get ordained. And what do? They get assigned to parishes. And they alter the theology. And they go to universities. And they stand in front of classes and teach errant theology. And the whole infection just spreads like crazy. This is what's happened to the church in the United States and Western Europe as well, including Australia. This is what's happened. It's happened over a very long period of time. Gramsci won. Stalin died, went to his grave. The Soviet Union eventually became, not as communist as it once was. But Gramsci won. All of the institutions of the West have been completely steamrolled by a sexual revolution, and the Catholic Church, because of the rot that was going on inside, was powerless to stand up and fight against it. Because the very men ordained and consecrated to do that had already betrayed the faith. Now, you want some concrete examples? Okay. There was a group in Miami called Christi Fidelis in the mid-2000s, a lay group like Stephen Brady's Roman Catholic Faithful just outside of Chicago. This group was in Miami, and a group of lay faithful Catholics, and they were all sitting around one day, a bunch of friends sitting around talking, boy, it sure seems like Father blah blah he seems a little gay. Like, well, I kind of think that about my guy too. Well, and they started to say, maybe we should investigate this a little bit. Well, they did. They hired private investigators, and they started following a huge number of Miami priests around, going in and out of gay bars. They got video, pictures, everything. They did their work for 3 years, compiling all of this. They got phone records that they were calling gay pornographic 800 numbers. They put all of it together into an enormous report. It's giant, hundreds of pages. Pictures, most of which you don't want to look at. Pictures, notes, priest by priest by priest. A giant dossier of little dossiers. One of the things in the dossier was that the director of recruitment, I remember saying Father, lost his name for a moment, was putting ads, they had copies of the ads in the report, in the big dossier, in gay bar publications in Miami, recruiting men for the seminary. And they had a series of them, week after week after week after week, in what are essentially like the gay bar, gay community, social, here's what's going on. The gay bar bulletin, to put it in a Catholic term. When the priest was confronted on this, he said, "Ooh, there was a printing error."
Printing error.
Oh, that ad was supposed to go in that publication. That publication was a churchy thing. Well, what's kind of funny, and they got them switched up. They mixed them up. They put the ads in there really week after week after week after week. And by the way, in the Our Lady of La Salette magazine, how come no gay thing ever popped up in that? If you got them switched, well, then the gay one should have been inside the Our Lady of La Salette magazine, and no one ever said, "Hey, oh my gosh, I opened it up, finding out what time there was a rosary, and I saw this horrible gay thing." Because it never happened. You may not remember, but about 4 months before the Archbishop, John Favalora, had turned 75, before he turned 75, Pope Benedict removed him. He just disappeared. That's why. Because of that report. So now you ask yourself, okay, well, Miami's the exception. Surely that didn't happen anywhere else. When he disappeared, the ABC station in Miami went around because it was like, where'd the bishop go? Oh, he's got health problems, he's gone. That's whenever you hear a bishop has health problems and he disappears, he doesn't have health problems. So the ABC station is standing out in front of Catholic parishes on Sunday saying, "Hey, what happened to the bishop? What do you think? What do you think about the bishop going away? What do you think about the bishop going away?" And they happened to, because the group had contacted the local media as well and sent them the press release of everything that was going on. So local media is out there asking questions, and they interviewed a priest at one of the parishes. And the priest, as large as life, right there, right in front of a camera, right on camera, full face, gave his name, parish he was at, and everything else, comes right out and says, "Well, it's ridiculous if we got rid of every gay priest in Miami, we'd only have about 10% of the priests left." Not making it up. This is all public record, every bit of it. So when you look around and say, what happened here with the clergy? Is this just a Miami thing? Okay, let's move to another location. Detroit, where we're from. The bishop there in 1965, well, before 1958 is when he was bishop, but when Vatican II ended in 1965, the Archbishop of Detroit, who became a cardinal, John Dearden, comes back from Rome and begins to institute what Time magazine and the New York Times said on his death in 1980, the most liberal reforms in the history of the church in America. Do you want to know who is responsible for your altars being torn off your reredos and the priest turning around and facing you? John Dearden. Eucharistic ministers, so-called, John Dearden. Girl altar boys, John Dearden. The Dan Schutte music hymnals, John Dearden. John Dearden said publicly that he wanted to use Detroit as the incubator to then spread throughout the entire country. And that is exactly what happened. In the midst of all of that, the seminary in Detroit, at the time, was St. John's in Plymouth, Michigan. It's kind of halfway between Detroit and Ann Arbor. Became such a hotbed for homosexual seminarians that it earned the nickname of Pink Palace. There are priests in Detroit right now, some of them are friends of mine, who were seminarians during that time. Every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock during school year, the seminarians would all go downstairs to the little TV viewing room back in the days of VHS tapes, and a gay porno VHS was put into the VHS player and they watched it. And attendance was mandatory. And this happened every Wednesday at 8 o'clock, and it was called the Human Sexuality class. The rector at the time was Bishop Kenneth Untner, who went on to Saginaw. The vicar general of the time was Thomas Gumbleton, vicar general of the diocese, archdiocese. One of the seminarians was so revolted by this that he started taking notes. And over the course of his 4 years, he took notes of what was a massive homosexual dominant culture in that seminary. When he was ordained, he gave his entire set of notes to a very trusted friend who had a very trusted friend who was a cardinal in the Curia, who was very tight with John Paul. That made it onto John Paul's desk. It completely bypassed the normal channels of going through Congregation for Clergy and this and that and everything else. John Paul called the Archbishop Edmund Shaka, and ordered the seminary shut down. And they all transferred to what is now Sacred Heart Seminary. Many of the priests who were involved in all of that in the 1980s are pastors in the Archdiocese of Detroit right now. And from what I've heard from the number of priests that I know who were seminarians there at the time, all of their stories match. Not everybody who was a seminarian was revolted by that, if you get my drift. Wednesday nights, one of the priests said, they used to call the guys who didn't want anything to do with this but were forced to go to it, they used to call Wednesday night chair night, because you would get back to your room as fast as possible and jam the chair under your doorknob for obvious reasons. So there are dozens of stories like this, and we hear every one of them because the priests who were involved with them, or they were seminarians or whatever, every single one of them we find out about. They call us, they tell us. Victims, priests who know about it, auxiliary bishops, and, frankly, even James Martin made a comment in public, a talk. I don't remember when this was exactly, within the last 2 or 3 months. It might not have been a talk, it might have been a writing or like a Facebook or something, but anyway, in public. And he said, there are thousands and thousands of gay priests in the priesthood in the United States. True. Yeah, okay. He's right on that. Straight across the board, the Catholic priesthood as an institution is dominated by a homosexual mindset. Writing in New York Times in her column, Maureen Dowd used the pretty accurate expression that the Catholic priesthood had become a gay profession. So, question for Cardinal Cupich. An enormous number of priests in a pretty small pool. And you're only talking about 40,000, Catholic priests. We're not talking about millions of, people here. You're talking about a pretty small pool. 40,000 is not that big of a sample. And within that 40,000, there are thousands of homosexual men. And over here, you have 80% of victims of sexual assault, rape, fill in the blank, are teenage boys. I don't know, maybe I'm jumping to a conclusion. Now, more to the point, as if that's not bad enough, many of the very same individuals who have been, meaning priests and bishops, who have been promoting this reign of homo terror in the church, are the very same bishops and priests who are also liturgically defiant, doctrinally defiant, devotionally defiant. All of this is all piece of a piece. It's all the same thing. We got an email 2 days ago from a priest. I don't want to say the diocese yet because we haven't finished investigating it, but the priest sent us, I don't know what social media platform they were on, Facebook, Pinterest, I have no idea, of 2 priests who are lovers, hugging and kissing and making out, 10 pictures. And at the end, he sends us the 11th and 12th frame of here are their official shots from the diocesan website. Right there, same guys. All we're doing is just doing some last minute verification. We'll have that story out at some point next week. The number of priests, homosexual priests, who are actively involved with other homosexual priests is staggering. And that does not stop because a man gets consecrated as a bishop. Now I know this is sickening to hear, the breaking of the vows. Some of these men also prey on teenage boys. Some, certainly not all, but some of them do. But many of them are breaking their vows. And they don't believe the Catholic faith. Yet they're standing in your pulpits, preaching on Sundays. If they still haven't managed to convince nobody to come to confession, then they give errant spiritual counsel in confession. They allow things published in their bulletins that the unsuspecting laity are reading. And little by little by little, one generation and then another generation, and that's why nearly every one of you put your hands up in here that at least 4, generally family members or people very close to you, have left the faith. Because what they have left isn't really the faith, because they were never taught the faith. The reason you're here is because you know the faith and you believe it. And because of that, you would never leave it. You would never leave it, at least in your intellect. I left it in my practice. Many of you know my story. I know so much about all this because I was in this. I know how that world operates. Sadly, but I know. But even in the midst of all of that, I knew that the Catholic faith, the Catholic Church, was the church established by God. I never for one instant in the depths of mortal sin did I ever consider going to another church. Because I knew the faith. I wasn't practicing it, but I knew the faith. Many of you have maybe had some sort of similar experience. You weren't always faithful, but you knew the faith. If you know the faith, you will eventually, if you leave, probably come back to it. Or you'll never leave to begin with. But see, this was the whole point. The whole point was to deprive Catholics of a knowledge of the faith. And they have been successful beyond their wildest imaginations. And so today, come to the present moment, what do we have? We have, I can share with you, I can't share with you how I know, but I can share with you that I know that a RICO investigation is being pulled together at the Department of Justice. I know that. And you're all cheering for it. Think about that. Think about that. There are, I kind of lost track now. We were doing break-in special reports every time another state announced a state attorney general investigation into all the dioceses. We just stopped because it got to be old news. There's 17 or 18 states right now. Many of those investigators call us. Go figure. They call us and say, so what do you know about this and what do you know about that? All of this that has happened, McCarrick, the grand jury report, all of the seminarians that McCarrick abused, all started, we've talked to a number of them. I can't tell you too much about this because we're still talking to some of them, but it has long been suspected that one of the other kingpins in this whole homo revolution in the clergy and the church, one of the major kingpins of it was Joseph Bernardine in Chicago.
Absolutely.
Well, we are talking to more than one. We are talking to more than one of his seminarian victims. Yes. And when you look at what happened in the church, the two most powerful prelates who dictated the flow of the church throughout all of the 80s and on, McCarrick and Bernardine, were homosexual predators of seminarians and boys. And what is happening right now is all of the evil, rotten fruit of this is finally being exposed. Because evil always gets exposed, because the truth always comes out. It is the nature of truth to be known. Little philosophy for you. It is the nature of truth. That's what defines it. It is the nature of truth to be known. So when you look at this whole mess that we're in right now, as a church, you have sick men, twisted men, who would throw themselves on seminarians and or teenage boys, completely getting off scot-free for decades, making recommendations to Rome on who should be appointed a bishop, who should not be appointed a bishop. During Joseph Bernardine came up through the ranks. He was just Bishop of Columbia, South Carolina. And when John Dearden needed somebody to sort of run the show for him, to be his lieutenant, he had Joseph Bernardine come up through the ranks. Joseph Bernardine is a disciple of John Dearden. Joseph Bernardine was responsible for the appointment of over 100 U.S. bishops.
Yep.
Over his time, with his influence, under the shadow of Dearden, in his role as president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, during his time in Chicago as the Cardinal Archbishop there, all those years, he got over 100 men appointed as U.S. bishops. You need to stop and kind of ingest the magnitude of this. Many of those men were gay. They appointed gay rectors at their seminaries. They appointed, gay vocations directors. When Bernardine was in Chicago, this is a Catholic cardinal, a successor of the apostles. He established the first openly gay office in the Archdiocese of Chicago. It's called AGLO. It still exists today. Yeah, the Association, the Archdiocesan Gay Lesbian Organization, I think it's called. I think that's what it stands for, AGLO. Still around today. In Detroit, one of the auxiliary bishops there, Bishop Reese, who's retired but still alive in Detroit, he set up what has turned out to be the longest running dignity mass in the world in Detroit. Right with the approval of Cardinal Dearden. When Cardinal Bernardine died of pancreatic cancer, he left in his will that he wanted the Chicago Gay Men's Chorus singing at his wake, which they did. A number of groups came through, but he specifically asked for that group, kind of like a final slap to the church. You have to understand the depth of the depravity, the complete rejection of everything the church teaches by a huge number of leaders in the church since the 1960s. And they just continue to proliferate. Now, one of these bishops, Daniel Ryan, was recommended to be bishop by Bernardine. He goes on to Springfield, Illinois. This is just 2 bishops ago. And rules the place with an iron fist and la 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 la. Horrible man, none of the priests liked him the whole bit, but he was an active homosexual. He used to go down to the city park and hire teenage boy prostitutes. That group, Roman Catholic Faithful, much like the group in Miami, Christi Fidelis, caught on to this, started putting their own dossier together, and it was a little easier route for them because some of the victims in this were actual minors. And they were able to prove that, and he had to step down. I can't remember exactly what happened. Some deal or something happened with the local prosecutor. I can't remember exactly what it was. He had sex with priests in his diocese routinely for years. What about those priests? Where are they right now? They're priests who would have sex with their bishop. Well, they didn't get removed. They're in parishes right now. I'm pretty sure they're not standing up in the pulpit on Sundays inspiring you to say the rosary.
Yeah.
This is widespread all throughout the church in America. Every bishop knows it. In private, the ones that you know that you will talk to will tell you, yeah, we know all about this. So now comes the question, well, why won't you say anything about it? Why don't you do something about it?
Yeah, what?
Yeah, you gotta be nice. You can't give offense. It's gonna hurt people's feelings. Why do you think, not just James Martin, lots of guys just go to the Los Angeles Religious Education Congress every March in LA? It's heretics on parade. Transgender this, gay this, bi the other. I mean, there's probably some talk in there about sex with animals if you look far enough into the program. How come none of these men are opposed? How come none of the bishops ever stand up and say anything about this? Because they're involved in it. One way or another, they are somehow involved with this. They're compromised because they don't want their career damaged. They're weak men, horribly weak men. Forget the robes, forget the mitres, forget the consecration, forget the ordination, just talking as a man, as a male member of the human race, they are weak. They are conflict avoidance. Never say anything. Of course, they set up all kinds of excuses for that. They hide behind, well, you can't give offense to people. Oh, well, don't ever talk about abortion from the pulpit because someone out there's probably had an abortion. And that'll hurt their feelings. You know, we have tons of seminarians in touch with us. I did a vortex earlier this week, I think it was Monday or Tuesday, a message to seminarians. I don't have time, but if I were to read you some of the texts I got from that, because a lot of these seminarians have my cell phone number, and they just text me. Oh, look what we're reading here. Oh, here, they'll take a picture of the textbook. And they'll say, oh, Father just said that Jesus didn't really rise from the dead. And on and on and on and on and on. James Martin doesn't believe Jesus is divine. So when you look at all these sorts of things, like, what happened? What happened? This is what happened. A complete and total ripping apart of the foundations of the Catholic faith here in America, and as well as Europe, but speaking specifically of the U.S. right now. Horrible theology. And it's happened because a few key people have been placed in a few key positions back in the day. When the question of birth control was on fire in the church from 1965 to 1968, when Pope Paul issued his encyclical Humanae Vitae, those 3 years in between the end of the Second Vatican Council and when he issued that encyclical, those 3 years, each summer, Theodore Hesburgh, the president of Notre Dame, was paid millions of dollars, Notre Dame was paid millions of dollars secretly through the Rockefeller Foundation to allow Planned Parenthood conferences to happen at on Notre Dame campus. The point of those Planned Parenthood conferences was to gather liberal American theologians and sit down and develop a document where Hesburgh would take the document to the Pope, because he's president of Notre Dame, and Notre Dame's all that, in a bag of chips, and present the document to Pope Paul to try to influence his teaching, influence his reasoning with Humanae Vitae. Not only did the Rockefeller Foundation give Notre Dame millions of dollars for those 3 summers, but in 1969, they made Ted Hesburgh the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, a foundation that supports worldwide abortion, sterilization, and birth control. Catholic priest in charge of the most prestigious Catholic university, depending on how you're measuring it, in the world, certainly in the U.S. Key people here and there. Hesburgh brought in a priest to Notre Dame's theology department, Father Richard McBride. Some of you will remember that name. And he began to systematically destroy the faith for 13 years of students in front of him. Thousands of students passed through the hands of Father Richard McBride at Notre Dame and left Notre Dame, the school of Our Lady, confirmed atheists. So, why do you have so many friends and family who don't practice the faith anymore? Because the entire faith was sabotaged. It was sabotaged by a combination of modernists and homosexual clergy who sought to accomplish this. And that's the reality. That's the reality. And if you're thinking that all of a sudden some wave of bishops is going to arrive, like the cavalry coming over the hill, Catholics always get those two words mixed up. There's going to be, it's not happening. It's not happening. Not for nothing, in 1972, did Bishop Sheen give a speech to the Knights of Columbus in Philadelphia and say, 1972, 72, more than 40 years ago, who is going to save our church? Do not look to the priests. Do not look to the bishops. It is up to you, the laity, to remind the priests to be priests and the bishops to be bishops. And nobody paid attention to it. Nobody. Well, we're paying attention now. Now we're paying attention with tens and tens of millions of souls having left the church. Get into your head, you are a member of a remnant, and you need to begin acting like you are a member of a remnant. You know, one of the things that's very interesting during political seasons, I spend a lot of my time in TV news as the political reporter, among other things, investigative and whatever. But during campaign seasons, no one else in the newsroom wanted to do it, and I loved politics. I loved politics since I was in 6th grade. I did that coloring the map, you know. Any of you remember Scholastic magazine? Yeah. They gave us one in 6th grade. Mrs. Healy gave it to me. We colored in during the Nixon McGovern campaign. I was coloring in all the states. I'm like, Dad, I ran out of ink for Nixon. So you had to go outside and get me another pen because you had to come in the next day with all the states colored in. That was the homework assignment. I got all jazzed up, loved politics ever since. No one else in the newsroom liked politics. I loved it, so I always got to be the guy head of the political unit. Learned all kinds of things. I went to CBS after Notre Dame. I was on Warren Matofsky's political unit during the Reagan-Mondale race in '84. Learned all kinds of things about how polls work and politics and all this and everything else. So one of the things that's always interesting during a campaign season is the enormous number of polls that are taken. Not just, are you going to vote for Trump or Hillary, but all kinds of, like, you know, what do you think of the state of the country, and what's your this, and how important are your religious values, and how much money do you make, and blah, 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 blah. Billions of questions. All this data from every